What can you tell me about the convention hall itself? It was called the Wigwam.
It was a newly built wooden structure that was built simply for this convention, and then shortly thereafter was torn down. This was pretty common because a lot of these halls that existed in 1860 would not be that large, and in a really large hall would be pretty useless. And so they would construct these temporary facilities, and you know, we think of that as a waste today, but they would reuse the lumber and everything. And the Wigwam was a great big political convention hall specifically for this convention.
More like a barn than anything we just think of today.
Pretty much, yeah.
Torches
in a lot
for
of
light?
ways. In a lot of ways, it was like a barn. There was a lot of manure there, I'm sure.
Well, the tobacco chewing and smoking
Sure.
and torches and
Yeah.
Was one end of it open?
I don't know if it was. I doubt whether it was, although I'm sure the ventilation, since this was in the summer, I'm sure the ventilation was extensive. And since this was a temporary structure, they didn't have to worry about heating it in the winter. So yeah, it was pretty much sort of like a movie set. Throw it up cheap, tear it down afterwards.
Now, if Las Vegas and the odds makers were in existence in that time period of 1860 in the summer, they would have said William Seward, the
he was probably the leading Republican candidate. However, he was rather strident in his opposition to slavery, and he had created a lot of resistance to his candidacy. There were a lot of people that didn't like Seward. If you're an outstanding figure for too long, you tend to generate enemies. And as we know in politics, it's not merely your support that counts, it's also the opposition. And so, for example, a modern politician like Sarah Palin has a lot of support, but she also has generated a lot of opposition. And this is part of the calculation. So Seward and Chase had their enemies.
Solomon Chase, the governor of Ohio.
Salmon P. Chase.
I stand corrected.
Close. And oddly enough, they're green, not salmon colored. But
you know, that might have been more appropriate than that. So the governor of Ohio was also, Chase, was also had that lightning rod effect because
he was a senator by this time, but he had been governor and senator. And yeah, he was a lightning rod like Seward. And so, as often is the case, the leading candidate, take for example recent presidential elections, I forget the name of the leading candidate in, the guy from Vermont, the leading Democrat.
Dean.
Yeah, Dean.
Howard
Dean. Dean was the leading candidate, but a lot of people didn't feel comfortable with him. And this is the same way Chase and Seward were. They had a lot of support, they had a lot of political power, but a lot of people didn't like them. And Lincoln had less of a high profile and fewer enemies. And he had made a name for himself. So,
well, there was another dark horse, and that was...
There were a lot of dark horses.
One of the most prominent was Edward Bates, who eventually became Attorney General for Lincoln.
Right.
Why wasn't he picked then?
Probably because he wasn't quite as well known as Lincoln. And in the first vote, Lincoln got over 100 of the votes. Bates got about 30, I think, or something like this. And so he just didn't have much oomph. And as political conventions used to go until maybe the past 30 years, you would have maybe multiple votes, and you would see if somebody was gaining. Seward got the most votes on the first vote, but then on the second vote, his total went down, Lincoln's was going up, there's a trend, and so eventually Lincoln gets enough votes and wins. Seward just couldn't get beyond a certain number because of people, there was a lot of opposition to his candidacy.
Did the public know, did the party know what Lincoln stood for at that time when he was nominated?
Oh, sure. Sure, because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This had pretty much staked out his position, which was opposition to slavery, leave it alone in the states that it exists now, but do not let it spread into the territories, and don't let it spread to the north. That was pretty clear. Douglas, in these debates, had put forth the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which meant that in the territories, the people in the territory could decide. And it sounded like a fairly democratic approach, but this is where Bleeding Kansas comes from. There was such violence and vote packing and you name it going on in Kansas that by the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the doctrine of popular sovereignty wasn't too attractive anymore because people had seen it in action and it wasn't pretty. It led to violence, murder, you name it. And so Douglas was still trying to defend that. And one of the things that he came up with was eventually known as the Freeport Doctrine. And that was this: if you're worried about slavery in your state, all that we have to do is just not enforce the slave laws and they can't have slavery in that state. Well, first of all, that's sort of a stretch, but second of all, it irritated the people in the South, which weakened his candidacy for presidency in 1860.
Before we get there, let's go back to the Republican Party. 1860, that's only the second time.
That's
I mean,
true.
It's a fairly new party and only the second presidential nominee. The first was in 1856 with Fremont, the explorer.
Yeah.
How was this party perceived nationally?
Nationally, in the North, very well. It didn't exist in the South. It was a sectional party completely. In fact, in the election of 1860, Lincoln got less than 40% of the votes, but those were all in the northern states, and when you add them all up, he wins the election. Even if every vote that, well, let me back up. There were 4 candidates, Lincoln and 3 others. Douglas was the
Democrat,
the prime opposition to Lincoln. Even if all the votes that went for other people had gone to Douglas, and Douglas had gotten 60% of the vote, he would have lost the election because the Electoral College count led to a victory for Lincoln. All the northern states, except New Jersey, I think, went for Lincoln. The southern states, less populous, fewer electoral votes, went for other people, but it still wasn't enough to have won the election.
Now, we were talking before we began recording here that the real game was the Republican convention that year.
It was. I mean, this was, by the time the Democrats had fragmented, it was, the money would have been on whoever the Republicans nominated. If I was going to lay odds, I'd say there's a 3-to-1 chance that the Republican's going to win this year if it was in 1860. So obviously there was a lot of attention focused on the Republican convention. And Lincoln's handlers, as we would call them today, were very canny in sort of organizing the vote. And remember, there were no primaries. So delegates would come and they would vote. They weren't already committed unless they had committed before they went there to a candidate or not. They were not governed by an election that had been held in their state. So there was a lot more fluidity to these things. In fact, there was a lot more excitement. I can remember in 1960 watching the conventions, and they were still open till the vote occurred. They weren't anything at all like they are today, very boring.
Now, you probably remember better than I because I was not cognitive back then, but wasn't it like the third ballot before Kennedy was got the nomination?
Actually, he won the first ballot, but there were votes being changed as the roll call was being taken, and it wasn't a sure thing until the end of the roll call. And so there was a lot of excitement, even 10, 15 years after that. After this, you know, we have primaries, and it's pretty much decided who's going to be president by March. The convention's in the summer. So what's there to do other than select a vice president?
Well, in our modern times, there's talk of party unity, that we've had a hard fight here. What about 1860 and the Republicans? Were they unified?
They did unify in back of Lincoln. And one way to gain unity, for example, well, let's look at this. Lincoln wins, Seward is disappointed, Chase is disappointed. Guess what? They're both in his cabinet in a few months. And this is one way to garner loyalty to your candidacy is to say, well, okay, you lost, but we've got a place for you. This is still done today now, isn't it?